district is 163, which is mostly the downtown area, Midtown, and Ardsley Park.
Well, it sprawls. So it's all the places that you named. It's the downtown area from Liberty Street south. Um, and all those neighborhoods that you just named right through the center, but it goes all the way out to Garden City. And it takes in a lot of neighborhoods, sort of on your way west, Liberty City, Tatumville, Cloverdale, um, historic Carver Village, and then it also kind of snakes southeast-ish to include the Vernonburg municipality. So that's a little municipality on the water here in Chatham County. And so, with the redistricting that just happened, the boundaries have changed. So definitely those central neighborhoods that you named, but it's a pretty sprawling district.
I wonder if I was looking at an old map.
You may have been, because it's not that easy. The last time I checked the house website, you had to look a little bit to find the new one. And it's if the usual places I go is I just look up the current rep, and then you can click on the district map. But I think that is still going to be the old map.
Yeah, because Derek Mallow, the General State Assembly, their voting session just ended, but Derek Mallow was representing the old map. And so their websites have the old maps.
So I'm Ann Allen Westbrook. I am a native Savannian. I was born here in Savannah and went to school all the way through high school in Savannah. Left to further my education. I went to college in Virginia and then came back to Georgia to attend law school at the University of Georgia. I've been back in Savannah as an adult for almost another 20 years. And pretty much my entire life, except babyhood, I've lived in some neighborhood that comprises the 163rd district. I've lived in downtown Savannah in the historic district. I've lived in the Victorian district. I've lived on the east side at the last little piece of this district on the east is right by the WW Law Center. And I lived for 5 years in the 1000 block of Bolton Street. So I know that east side very well also. And now I live in Ardsley Park with my family. So I'm a lawyer by profession. I practice in the area of family law. So I help folks through challenging life transitions like divorce and custody and recovering from accidents. I am a mother of 3 boys in a blended family. My husband is also a lawyer. And this is home for us. So that's sort of my Savannah story. How I got interested in running for office is about 10 years ago. I got involved with an organization called Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. That is the largest grassroots group of volunteer advocates working to end gun violence. And we know in Savannah that's a persistent issue that has persisted over decades, over mayoral administrations. And there's a real problem with that at our state legislative level because the state legislature preempts local governments from doing anything to address that policy. So basically they say, we're going to make all those laws for you in Atlanta and you're going to live with them in Savannah, and things don't work as well in things that work okay in rural areas can really be a problem in metropolitan areas like Metro Atlanta, like Savannah, like Augusta and Macon. So that persistent problem is what got me interested in legislative work. And so I've done that work for 10 years as a volunteer. I coordinated state legislative efforts for the Georgia chapter of Moms Demand Action. And what I found doing that work is just a real disconnect between the leadership of the majority party, the Republican Party in Atlanta, and the values of my friends and family and coworkers and neighbors, here in Savannah. So that's what got interested in doing this is I really think we need more folks bringing their values to the table of decision making. And so that's why I have run. I am a second-time candidate. I actually ran for this office in 2020 and lost the race by 19 votes. It was the closest race in Georgia that cycle. But with politics being unpredictable, I'm back 2 years later, not for a rematch, but because the winner, Rep. Derek Mallow, is running for an open Senate seat. So you have to stay ready in politics.
Mm-hmm. How important do you think it is to run more than once, even if you've failed? Do you think of failure as the voters saying, don't run again, or do you think it's just that it takes time to establish this relationship with voters?
That's a good question. And I think in my case, I got 49.82% of the vote in 2020. So to me, yes, I failed at that first attempt, but that was a real vote of confidence from the voters that the things that I talked about in 2020 resonated with a lot of people. It wasn't quite enough to make me victorious that cycle, but you're correct that, most candidates don't win their first race. So I learned a lot from that cycle. I was running in a pandemic. I mean, we all were, so the playing field was very even in that sense. But there's a lot that I'm getting to do this cycle of face-to-face and asking voters, what are the issues that you care about? Here's what brought me to this work, but what are the pressing issues in your neighborhood, in your part of the district? So that's been really good, is to get that face-to-face time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to talk about affordable housing, and I think it actually kind of has to do with the violence as well, because it's obvious that when you don't have this economic balance of giving people the jobs that can afford the lives in this city, if you have rent that is out of reach of the available jobs, I know that's not an issue that one person can tackle, but how do you feel about that issue? What are your creative solutions, or how do you view this issue?
That's a great question. And yeah, I agree with you. I think gun violence is a piece of this conversation for sure. And I'll just say, gun violence isn't caused by guns, in my opinion. It's caused by those root causes of inequality, of poverty, of lack of access to resources, and lack of opportunity. The district I am running in is sort of a poster child for inequality, because we have a part of the landmark historic district. Part of it is also in the 165th, but we have the housing in the historic district is beyond the reach of the wealthiest Savannaians for the most part. This isn't just that, middle and middle class and below Savannaians can't afford to live there. Hardly anyone in Savannah can afford those prices at this point. And so, I mean, definitely there is an affordable housing piece of this. We have persistent poverty in this community. And so, that inequality is so stark here. And so the question is, well, what do we do about that? Some of these are forces driving up the cost of housing, and some of this is lack of jobs that pay a livable wage. I'd like to see us diversify our economy more to the extent we can. We have a lot of hospitality jobs that don't pay high wages, that don't have great benefits. We don't have the hospitality union, to my knowledge, government that is quite hostile to labor. And so, for example, one of the other areas that they preempt local governments is from setting sort of, fair wage and fair labor standards in their local communities. Now, the city of Savannah could say, well, we're going to pay our employees a livable wage, but they can't set any kind of standards for the rest of employers to do that. So there is a real disconnect with the available housing and jobs that will actually get you into those houses. You know, one thing that we're seeing some creative partnerships. The Stark Savannah Foundation has been talking recently about some of its projects. You know, one thing that we love about Savannah that makes us unique is we have such a history of preservation here. And that's one thing that makes a lot of us want to live here, and it makes a lot of people want to visit here. But you know, that is old housing stock. It's expensive to maintain and keep up. It's expensive to heat and cool in the extreme months. So I've been happy to see the Stark Savannah Foundation partner there and say we're going to attach some covenants that require this to stay affordable and not just turn this over to the whims of the market, because we know what happens with the whims of the market and housing. You know, we're seeing that in downtown Savannah with, you know, I was talking to a friend recently who was asking me for a sign. We were talking about neighbors, and he said, I don't really have neighbors anymore because, you know, the house behind me is listed for $5 million. I don't really know. There are not many people in Savannah who can buy that house. And if they're working, you know, there's maybe a small handful that can, but very, very few, and very few people who are actually working for their money as opposed to, you know, benefiting from an inheritance or something like that. So it's a multi-layered problem. Definitely like to see better leadership at the state level, less hostility to, you know, to some local policy that would address this. You know, one other thing that's going on in the state is we're seeing a real, you know, more and more our population is located in our cities, and our rural areas are losing population. And so, you know, rural legislators have a lot of sway in the General Assembly, but we are the ones living with these problems in the city. I knew somebody who wanted to move back to Savannah. She'd lived here previously, moved to Augusta, and she finally gave up on finding any kind of housing that she could afford, because it happens in the, you know, in the purchase market, rental market as well.
I do think it may have something to do with the rentals, obviously Airbnb, VRBO. That's definitely what my neighborhood is. It's really just a lot of short-term rentals. I don't mind it per se, but if you have rental companies that buy more than one property, it makes me sad, to be honest. It's like these beautiful homes are not being lived in by real people. They're just tourist market, and understandably that's what makes the economy strong, is the tourism, but there's this balance that has to be struck. And obviously SCAD also buying a lot of properties has a lot to do with you know, the way the city has been shaped.
Right. I think, yes, that's true. And I'll just say on the short-term vacation rental issue, you know, I'm not black or white on that one either. I've enjoyed staying in, you know, Airbnbs when I've traveled. I understand the appeal of them, but they do change the character of neighborhoods. And I think that the emergence of that market is something that a lot of local governments didn't really see coming and weren't ready for, and weren't ready for the changes that they would make, you know, in Savannah, on Tybee, you know, a number of places, not just in the historic district. So that's a good place to point out that, you know, there have been efforts in the state government to prohibit local governments from making their own short-term vacation rental ordinances. So we got to really think about what the effect of that is going to be. This is a unique part of the state. You know, folks, we get millions of visitors every year. And so we need to keep that decision-making authority in the hands of our local elected officials, because they can be more responsive to this and not just turn this over to the state, which really state tends to really give a lot of deference to private property interests, and whatever I want to do with my property is my business, and the effect on you or on your community, you know, is not my problem, so to speak. I just disagree with that approach. It's something that did not pass 2 years ago, but when it was proposed, but I suspect we're going to see it again.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but each state can designate these things for local ordinances. So it's almost like you don't know who to ask. Are you going to ask the mayor to change this, or you're going to ask your local, your state representative? And then even if your state representative is someone who wants to fix it, if they're not in the majority party, there's nothing they can do. So it's a very real struggle, but it also makes the elections tricky because you don't really know what people are capable of. I mean, what each representative is capable of, what you're voting for, and I actually think that's part of the ambiguity that dissuades voters from thinking their vote matters. I do believe that votes matter,
Right.
um, and maybe that's a question I should have written on my paper, but I'll ask it now. How do you feel about the importance of a vote, even if you're not in the majority party? I mean, what is what is it all for if we can't necessarily change anything right now? It's a tricky question, but
Great question. That's a great question. First, I'll just take, voting and why it matters. This is how we determine our destiny. This is, we can watch what's going on in Ukraine, and with that real resistance to, being taken over by a country that doesn't have, that only on its face or has free and fair elections. I mean, this is self-determination. This is human rights. This is as basic as it gets, voting. And it's why, in terms of my platform, that's my top issue. We have seen this in Georgia, just the chipping away and the chipping away of policy that facilitates voting. I mean, we want people to vote, so that's the top of my platform. I was glad to see that this year effort, there was so much that was added in SB 202 last session that burdens voters and burdens voting. And I was so heartened this session that we pretty much resisted those additional burdens. And the only thing that really got added was giving people more time off of work to vote. So that's a big victory. Second question is, though, we really do need to talk about the anti-democratic, small d, counter-majoritarian forces that are at work here, such as partisan gerrymandering. Now, I know that, partisan gerrymandering happens in most states, that only a small number have put in independent commissions. I know it's something that my party did in past, 20 years ago when they were in the majority. So, but there are some changes, and that, technology makes it easier and easier and easier to just carve out this little bit here. We know exactly, how neighborhoods vote. So we need to really look at that, because our legislators, our leaders should be responsive to their voters. And when they, as the majority party, pick their voters, then voters can't pick their leaders. And that's really, that's just so counter-majoritarian, and it really does undermine people's confidence. I am running in a safe Democratic district. There are no Republicans running in this. Because of how the district is drawn, it would be next to impossible for a Republican to win this district. And I think, that's frustrating for people. And I think it's part of why we see, I think it is more happening on the right, which is, these races being predetermined because of gerrymandering. There's no incentive to be responsive to your entire district, to listen to everybody, your entire district. Your goal is to basically fend off a primary challenge. So my response to, what we do with that, or, how we kind of keep hoping and keep investing, is I think we, in these safe Democratic districts, we've got to elect the strongest possible Democratic leaders who can do the most with that safe Democratic, seat. Not get too comfortable, not stop working because, oh, what does it matter? We don't have the majority anyway. you've got to find ways to be creative, and you've got to find ways to build bridges. And we've done a little bit of that. We had a great bipartisan mental health bill passed this year. That was huge. An issue I've been talking about for a long time is the just abysmal rates of maternal mortality that we have in Georgia. And we're finally starting to break through the partisan gridlock on that, because, that's a real black eye on the state when you lose so many mothers in that, postpartum period. So there's been some compromises struck there with moderate Republicans, some of them with medical backgrounds. So there are things you can do. And then I'm just going to be straight. I mean, we got to flip a bunch of seats, and we've got to be, we have to look at where we can flip some seats, either locally or in the metro Atlanta area that has, much sort of faster demographic change. And, we've got to build our political power within the state. And that's really hard to do, because it requires, Democrats always have to build coalitions of people with divergent interests and divergent backgrounds. But that's what we've got to do in order to build any kind of political power in this state, so that we get protections for voters, so that we get expanded access to health care, so that we get real about the climate crisis, which we know is going to affect us on the coast. And, being just 100 miles of coast and, sharing a state with a metropolitan area like Atlanta, we have to really, be loud to be heard.
Mm-hmm. And on gerrymandering, you've mentioned something that I think is interesting, which is that because local races are so gerrymandered, this is what I was told, they are basically safe seats. Mm-hmm. There are not a lot of, what do they call them? Flippable districts or on the fence districts. Mm-hmm. And that, it's kind of a funny issue, because it takes away the risk of the candidate. The candidate, as you said, wins the primary and knows that it's in the bag. All a Republican or a Democrat has to do is understand the district's gerrymandered participation, and the end of the race. There's no surprises. It's not even a race per se. And I don't think voters understand that. I think we're getting to understand that, but we've just done redistricting, and it's going to be a new influx of this feeling like nothing you do matters. When you have these races that are pressured to be one thing or another, you're just constantly eroding the will of the people to a point where the will of the people don't even recognize who they are anymore. But look at Georgia as a state. When you do a statewide voting, we have 2 Democratic senators. And then when you look at the Georgia General Assembly, somehow individual districts have all of these Republican senators or state senators and state representatives. And so I don't know, it's one of those things where I think that people have to slowly change their perception of who they are and what power they have, and understand that this is not real, that it's a sort of illusion. The will of the people is not being represented by these races. Mm-hmm. And even though that makes us angry, ultimately, that's why we have to keep putting pressure on our state legislatures, because it's not as if they are representing their accurate districts. And it's, we play nice sometimes and we say, okay, they won a fair fight and now they're in their position and we have to respect that position. It's just, I don't think they're very fair fights in the first place.
And even in these primary only races, it really does matter who we elect, and that we get the strongest possible people, because there is a lot you can do. And I think that's one thing that I bring to this is years of experience working on, various policy initiatives, and also relationships that I've built doing that work. So I come in as someone who is known to a lot of the Democratic legislators and leaders, and that's a foundation that I can build on and that I can use for the benefit of this district. So, one of the things that stinks about gerrymandering is it does give you less choice at election time. You're just choosing from within a primary. And that tends to lead to uncontested primaries, except when there's an open seat like there is this year. But I think it's so important that we think carefully about who we send to do these jobs, and make sure that it's folks who will work for the whole district, who are talking to the whole district, and who are really building those relationships.
I learned about gerrymandering something interesting, which is that there are two types, and one is gerrymandering by party line, and one is gerrymandering by race. Gerrymandering by race is illegal. In this state, it's illegal, but gerrymandering by party line is not illegal in this state. Unfortunately, though, we all know that it's obvious that Democrats have become very racially diverse and Republicans are not. And so all the Republican has to do in that legislature, in that specific district, is say, we're not targeting African Americans, we're targeting Democrats, which is lawful. Mm-hmm. And yet it's the same result anyway. So it's kind of,
especially when you consider how many African American, the Democratic Party's strongest base in Georgia is African American voters because of that historic commitment to civil rights. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap between party and race, and yet it's okay to gerrymander by party. A couple other things you brought up, I think, are important, and that's the redistricting cycle that we just finished. And that, in 2020, we were talking a lot about that. And I think we have to remember that this is a long game. It's done for this cycle, unless the court strikes some of it down. And I do think there's some cases in litigation, but we've got to be preparing now for the next cycle, because if we get interested 2 to 4 years before the next redistricting, it's going to be too late and we're going to be locked into this pattern. So I try to always talk about it. Our growth down here in the Savannah area is not as rapid as Atlanta. So it's hard, in Atlanta, it's pretty hard to stay, for the gerrymandering forces to kind of stay ahead of the demographic change, but it's not as hard down here. So we have to, really organize.
I've noticed a little bit that there are some Democratic representatives that maybe have just lost the passion, or because they're outnumbered, they've taken a comfortable back seat and they cruise without even necessarily thinking. It's not that I want to accuse them of anything, but where is the passion? Where is the enthusiasm? Because we in Georgia are really at an exciting time, on the verge of change. Hopefully we're going to have Stacey Abrams as our governor, and she very much deserves to represent these people who want her, who clearly want her. So it's just a question of, how do you keep up the enthusiasm, and what could drive you to fight harder, even if these forces make you resign and lean back.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, because these once you win an open seat, it tends to be pretty, historically at least, pretty easy to kind of hang on to that seat, because it's really just becomes well, I'm just choosing among Democrats. Does it really matter? They're all going to vote the same way anyway. But the representation is really a lot more than just the votes you take. I mean, that's kind of the minimum that we can expect. I mean, I expect Democrats to stand up for fully funding public schools. I expect them to stand up for racial equality and justice. I expect them to stand up for access to health care and women's bodily autonomy and all of those issues. But it's relationships you build. It's what you do in committees. It's bringing that same enthusiasm to your committee work that you bring to the votes. So, while it can definitely happen that people get comfortable, especially when, once they've been in a while, it doesn't have to be that. And, when we get the right folks up there, there's some leaders in Atlanta who they fight the good fight year after year after year, even against long odds. I mean, I've been working on gun violence prevention in Georgia. So, I mean, I'm a veteran of like 2 guns on campus fights in the 2016, 2017 era. And I can remember the senators and the reps up there who just left it all out on the floor on those floor debates about that issue, because it's important and because their constituents care and because their constituents want them to. So, it can be done with the right leadership. And I think, I try to just, anytime I can educate, I try to, and just say, your state legislature has a lot of power over our lives. I know you're focused on what Buddy Carter's doing, and the cable news cycle in Washington it draws us all in like a reality show. I know you're watching what city council's doing, but there is so much going on in the General Assembly that will affect your life day in and day out. And so, to the extent I can help people to understand that and get interested in that, I'm always going to do that.
Mm-hmm. I just remembered something. I think it was 2013. When did the House in DC, they were sitting on the floor protesting gun violence, and it was John Lewis, I think, was the one who was leading
after the Pulse shooting. I want to say that was 2015, but those images are burned in my mind. And I think in the House we didn't have the numbers. Mm-hmm. And so, what are you going to do to put pressure? And that gets to your other question, which is, what do you do when you don't have the numbers? Well, you get creative. Mm-hmm. And if it takes putting a civil rights icon, sitting on the floor, then that's what you do. Yeah. So that's a great example.
Yeah, I mean, I look at politics as a sort of evolution of enthusiasm, to be honest. I mean, quite frankly, it's not necessarily about having the numbers at the beginning. It's about earning the numbers through passion and through fighting for these issues. And that was one of those times when I was really not very political, but very proud, just of the ability of those legislators to just show some substance, and I think that needs to happen, that people have to have substance behind what they're doing, and not just do it for the basic functionality of government. I mean, there has to be a reason that you're doing it. I do think that Republicans erode that passion, they erode that enthusiasm, and I really think that that's what is maintaining their power, is not just cheating but also dissuading Americans from caring. Yeah. It's really shocking that we have such apathy. So voter apathy is really important. Do you have anything to add on voter education and what we can do to encourage it, whether it comes from education in schools or whether it comes from organizations, or what can we do to teach people how politics works?
I think it's an all of the above. I certainly would like to see more robust curriculum in schools about this. And I also think that, we're in a moment right now where the landscape is just constantly changing. And there's a level of exhaustion that sets in with that too. Like I said, I was a candidate in 2020, and I was running in an unprecedented time. It was a pandemic. I commend our Secretary of State for the actions he took. This is a Republican, Secretary Raffensperger, sending out all those absentee ballots so that people didn't have to make a choice between feeling safe from a pandemic, from a virus, and exercising their right to vote in a presidential election, no less. So, I did a lot of educating then. And then we went into the next legislative session and passed SB 202, and the entire landscape changed. And so I have to, I had to relearn it all. And now I have to, make sure other people have learned all those changes too. And there's a level of kind of exhaustion with that that's not quite fair to voters, in my opinion. Again, this gets back to, we want people to vote. We want to facilitate it. And if we're constantly sort of moving, changing the rules, it's just harder to do that. So I think there's a schools piece of it that should really be part of a curriculum throughout. And then there's certainly a role for organizations to play, and we have some great organizations working on that. Black Voters Matter does a fantastic job. League of Women Voters does a fantastic job. Not two nonpartisan organizations who really just, who you vote for is your business, but we just want you to vote. And we want to do anything we can to help you do that.
One of my questions was, because the Georgia General Assembly is controlled by Republicans, how do you foresee yourself handling this prickly conundrum? Do you feel there are other ways you can represent or fight for us? Do you think it's about establishing relationships with your GOP opponents? Do you think it's about increasing voter education? So I know you've kind of answered those already, but if you want to add anything to those questions.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the relationships with the GOP, because I think that's a good thing to talk about. I think you have to build relationships, and I am a person who I know what I believe. I know why I'm in this party. It's because of the policy goals of the party, because the party tries to bring in everybody, which I think the other party does not. But at the same time, there are times to compromise. You just can't compromise too much. But I think relationships are hugely important to that. They're just, something happens when we get face to face and we start relating just as human beings. We kind of get out of that sort of cable news bubble and internet bubble that tells us that we're enemies. And I think that there are a lot of areas where there's broad agreement. And I think that just because you're in one part or the other doesn't make your motives pure or impure. And so, you just try to connect with the other side on issues that will lift us all up, policy goals that will lift us all up. There are a lot of things like that. And just, try to see each other as human beings who are both there to work for the people who sent us there. And not as adversaries.
Mm-hmm. Do you know any, you're not in the Georgia General Assembly, but do you know any information about the two bipartisan bills that I think they were working on? One was sex trafficking and one was mental health. Did you hear anything about those?
The one I know that I know a little more about is mental health, and that was a priority that Speaker Ralston made from the beginning. He brought in Rep. Mary Margaret Oliver, a Democrat of Decatur, from the very beginning. She is a great example of somebody who has a lot of respect on both sides of the aisle. She's had committee leadership, even under a Republican majority. So my understanding of the mental health bill is that it's going to cover quite a lot more. Georgia was sort of very near the bottom in terms of mental health coverage. And so while this isn't perfect, it's definitely going to increase the amount of coverage, and that's a win for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I think it's perhaps wise to talk about voter suppression a little bit. We did talk about it already, voter education. This is an issue that doesn't affect you and I as much. It really does affect African Americans, and they are targeted. And I think that's one thing that has to be acknowledged. It's personal. It is designed specifically to shut them out of the voter process. It's hard to ask a question about that. I mean, it's, how do you empathize? How do you prioritize? And how do you understand that it's really critical?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are in Georgia. We are a deep South state. We're a former Confederate state. We are a state that under the Voting Rights Act was subject to preclearance until the Shelby versus Holder decision of the 2014-2015 timeframe. So we have a history in Georgia, and it is a fact, and we need to acknowledge it. And that is that we, for years and years and years, had Jim Crow laws that were designed to keep Black people from voting, because Black people in Georgia and other states like Georgia have always had numbers. And so we had to come up with ways in a one person, one vote country to undermine the influence that they rightfully should have had from the very beginning. So, that might be a poll tax, that might be a literacy test, count the jelly beans in the jar kind of stuff, whatever it was. That's our history. And the unfortunate part of this is that the Supreme Court said in the Shelby versus Holder decision, that's over. That's all in our past. So we don't need to keep an eye on states with this history. And so as a result, did away with preclearance. So now if we want to close a certain number of precincts, or if we want to, close a precinct in a majority Black county or whatever it is, we can do that without that federal oversight. And, that federal oversight is what finally ushered us out of that history of having the laws on the books. Doesn't mean it fixed everything, but so that is really unfortunate. And I think we have seen in the years since Shelby that we weren't really as far along as we would have liked to have seen. There are still so many ways that we communicate that voting isn't for everybody. I've done hundreds of hours of voter protection work. I did it for the first time in 2008 during President Obama's first election. He was making a real pitch to returning citizens to make sure they knew if you were off papers, you can vote. You have just as much right to vote as anybody else. So that's something I saw firsthand during that election, registering voters and poll watching. I think we need to talk a little bit about the Southern strategy and, the transformation of the Republican Party. Republican Party in the era of Lincoln was on the side of bringing Black Americans into full participation. And so that switched. So, so much of what forms the modern day Republican strategy has echoes of that period in our past. And so, and this ties into the broader point of, like, if a party is not opening up its tent and trying to bring more people in, then the only way really left to hang on to power is to make it hard for the people you're not inviting in to vote. So that's a long way of saying all that in terms of history. I am going to every corner of this district. This is my community. This is my home. I am talking to folks in every single neighborhood in this district, and they care about voting rights. That is, they understand it's fundamental. They understand, Black voters in my district understand that there are folks who don't want them to vote. And, I think it just makes them more determined to do that. So, I'm a big believer that there are policy goals that elevate us all, and voting is one of those. And when we all vote, we get other policy objectives that elevate us all. So, the only way to build power as Democrats is to build a big tent, set a longer table, bring everybody in. And, that's really just the only way to counter the other side.
I do have, I guess, one more question. This is a personal issue for me, which is abortion rights. And I just want to say this background. I used to think it was actually never, ever going to happen. I thought it was abortion bans were a sort of red herring or smokescreen. I mean, just something to distract us. I mean, there are certain elements of, like, book bans and don't say gay bans and abortion bans that sometimes I think it's meant to scare away Democrats, to make them not feel welcome, to not feel safe, because when they leave, they're not there to vote. And so it's kind of a twisted voter suppression. However, it is becoming more and more real since Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court nominees. And just yesterday, Oklahoma's state legislature passed a total abortion ban, 100%, making it a felony. And so Georgia will come up with these in our future, and we do have to face them. So, how do you feel about this issue, and how do you feel about standing up for the issue even if you don't have the votes, and voicing a protest?
I agree with you in that, this is starting to get real. This is getting real for women. Like, something that we know there is broad agreement on this, that, across party lines, whatever our personal feelings about this, we believe that, the abortion framework of, Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey should stand. And I think it really comes down to, well, before I get to that, I want to talk about HB 481 in Georgia, because we've been there, and so when 481 was passed, that was passed fully knowing it was unconstitutional, fully knowing it was immediately going to get us into court. We would be spending taxpayer money on this. And, that is something our General Assembly did, knowing it was unconstitutional, knowing the physicians of this state were dead set against it, that it was terrible practice. And the women of this state were very much opposed to it as well. And I think what it really comes down to is someone's got to decide. And I will always trust the women of Georgia, my friends, my nieces. I will always trust them to make these intimate decisions for themselves before I will trust the General Assembly. I just don't think it's the business of the state to make those decisions. And I think if we sort of play that tape all the way through and think about what that will look like, if we do give the state that kind of power over these decisions, you can get to some pretty nightmarish scenarios pretty quickly. Every woman has a story. It might not be an abortion story, but every woman has a story. And, we know that we can be trusted, that we should be trusted to make these decisions. I often point out, who do you think is taking care of the children who are already here? We're doing that work predominantly. That's not to say, men aren't doing any, but when it really comes down to it, we do that work, and we can be trusted with this decision. We should be trusted with this decision. And I will never hand this decision off to the state. I think that gets you to some, you can follow that thread to China and North Korea. And when the state starts telling you what you can do with your body, we get way past abortion very quickly. We get into contraception, and we get into, all kinds of things. So this is a decision for the women of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's interesting, well, maybe not interesting, surreal, because the predominantly Catholic countries like Mexico and Ireland, which have had abortion illegal this whole time, are now shifting just in the past, let's say 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. And we're going backwards, and we're
I remember, you bring up Ireland. I remember reading, I think, again, that's one of those areas where there can be broad agreement sometimes, even when you're having policy debates, or even when your policy doesn't reflect your broad agreement. But there was a woman who died because she was pregnant and it was going to kill her, and she needed to leave the country and get somewhere where she could terminate that pregnancy in order to save her own life, and she died. And that was one of the, and I don't want to get into ranking the reasons for abortion, because I just don't think that's the business, but that's one of those scenarios we go to. And so for those of us, who've had children, we lie on those tables, we get those transvaginal ultrasounds, we hear those, diagnoses from doctors at 18 and 20 weeks. And, and of course, when you're at 18 and 20 weeks, you're out of the range for having an abortion in a lot of states. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. It's crazy to be going backward when, you know, other countries are finally coming around to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Raphael Warnock said eh, I can't remember the word he used,
Yeah.
the room that you're in, the doctor's room is too large.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
We all know it's even it's just immoral to oppress women and immoral to own their bodies, immoral to have a room of men who have never been pregnant, who are making decisions about people who have been pregnant. I mean, it's just an inhuman thing to treat women as this object or this cattle to.
Vessel. Yeah, absolutely.
So it is surreal, but it's our reality. And I think that's kind of one of those things where, it's like it's unbelievable and yet we're here. And so you have to pinch yourself. Yes, we're here 50 years after Roe versus Wade. It's a real danger. So, but I do think that, we have enough people that we can fight for this issue. And that's why I led the Women's March in Savannah and organized it, honestly, not because I had to force people to care. I think that was, I don't have any special powers. I cannot snap my fingers and get 1,000 people to show up at Forsyth Park for anything. They have to want to be there. And I just felt like Savannah wanted to be there. And this was really critical and important for people. So it's definitely going to turn around eventually if we keep, feeling pressured by the GOP inching closer and closer. So well, that was my last question. So I'm going to give you just a minute to reflect on all the questions we asked. Is there anything you think we missed? Is there a specific part of your campaign that I didn't bring up?
No, I think we really we covered a lot in a fairly short amount of time. So I'll just say thank you for having me. I always welcome the opportunity to talk about issues with voters, and you're giving me the chance to do that. And I'm very grateful. I know it takes work to put these on, but I always want to, give folks an opportunity to hear me answer questions on the issues, answer tough questions, because that's what the job is when you get up there is wrestling with these tough questions. So thank you for that. I'll just tell folks how to get in touch with me. My website is my name, Anna Allen Westbrook, ga163.com. I'm pretty active on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. So you can engage with me there. My email address is on my website, my phone number. I'm very happy to answer any questions that people have, either by email or by phone. And people have been reaching out, and I really appreciate that. Folks have reached out and said, well, I want to talk about criminal justice reform, and I want to know what you think about returning citizens. And it's all fair game. The voters are entitled to it. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking this morning.